Hello, everyone. Welcome to Book Talk with Cara. It's Tuesday night, and so that means I get to introduce you to one of my writing friends. And tonight I am so excited to introduce you to Janyre Tromp. And what's really fun about her, and a little different from the other book talks that we have had, is that she is an editor with Kriegel Publishers. So we're going to talk about what it's like kind of from the other side of the computer, where you're the person who's acquiring books and then working with the authors. But at the same time, she is also a writer. And so she has novellas coming out and a big book coming out in March. And so I wanted to make sure I introduced you to her because she writes historical, some of them in World War II, some of them closer to Vietnam. And I think you're really going to enjoy getting to know Janyre. So would you like to introduce yourself to those who are joining us?
So much for having me, Cara. It's been so fun getting to know you over the last year. This writing world is such a fun world, and everybody coming from different places. So like Cara said, my name is Janyre. Just in case you want to know where in the world the name came from, I'm named for a friend of my mom's who is Brazilian. So that's how I ended up with my name. But I am a writer. I am an editor. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have two cats that are kind of insane. One is sitting right over there. So if you all of a sudden see a fluffy tail, that would be Brave is his name. And then I also have a Shetland sheepdog that we rescued, and he's a little quirky, if we can say it that way. So yeah, I've been an editor. Gosh, I've worked for Kriegel for more than 20 years. I've been an editor for about 18 years. I love books. That's what it comes down to. I love books.
I think that's one of the things that we actually kind of connected on, because I first met you at ACFW when you were on an agent panel that I was hosting and moderating. And it became very quickly apparent that you just love books, and it doesn't take any time on your Instagram feed or anywhere else. You're always talking up books. So when did you fall in love with the written word?
When I was born. Right?
I feel that so much. It's like, when did I not love words?
So I seriously read C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was in first grade, like on my own. It was not read to me.
Oh, that's awesome.
In first grade. So I have always loved words. I have always loved to read. I've always had my nose in the book. I was one of those kids that at night I was supposed to be sleeping, and I was under my covers with my night light.
Yes. Yeah, I did the same thing. And then, so that if you were under the covers with the flashlight, then they couldn't see the light coming through your door, so you could read longer.
Yeah. Yep. That's exactly it. So, so I started school. I don't know if I told you this. I started college as a chemistry major.
What?
I did. And I got straight A's. It wasn't that I was bad at it. I just hated it. And I called my mom, freshman year, like crying. What am I going to do? I hate chem. And she's like, well, do what you love. And I said, and I quote, nobody gets paid to read, Mom.
And look at what you've done. You created a career where you get paid to read.
So the moral of the story is Mom is always right.
That's right. So how did you get started in publishing and with editing?
So I have an English major with an emphasis in writing, and then my minor was PR and marketing. And I almost had as many credit hours in my PR and marketing minor as I did in my English major. So when I graduated, I was really well suited to step into marketing. So I ran the publicity and marketing department for Kriegel for about 8 years. And about halfway through that, our managing editor discovered that my degree was actually English, and pulled me into the loop with the acquisition side of things. So I worked part-time as an editor as I was running the marketing department for Kriegel. And then when I had kids, when my kids were little, I worked part-time for editorial from home. And then I just kind of have taken more on more and more responsibility until I'm where I am now. So
That's awesome. So
yeah.
do you edit primarily fiction, or do you do a blend of fiction and nonfiction?
I do both fiction and nonfiction. I develop about 80% of Kriegel's titles. And so we do about 52 titles a year. So I don't know what the math is. I do about 40 books. I do about 40 books a year. And we do about half and half. So I do like 20 fiction, 20 nonfiction in a year.
So what's the difference as an editor? Now, as a reader, obviously I want to be completely engrossed in a story world if I'm in fiction, whereas when I'm reading nonfiction, depending on the type, maybe I want to be swept into a story. Otherwise, maybe I want to learn something. But on the editorial side, what makes those two genres or big buckets of books different?
So when it comes to developing books, remarkably, they're very similar because I look at kind of that 30,000 foot view of a book. So it all comes down to outline. So does it flow from point A to point B in a logical manner? Did we miss anything along the way?
Yeah.
So I make outlines for both and go through them. The difference for me is that editing fiction is a more natural place for me to be because that is primarily what I read. I read a lot of nonfiction, but I read vast majority of my reading is actually fiction or story-based. I love narrative nonfiction. You and I both love them, Cara. We
Yes.
talk about them all the time.
Well, and that's something that I think is really interesting, both from the editing and from the writing standpoint, that I think you have to be a reader first, and you have to just be in love with words and stories and communicating ideas, or it's going to be really hard to know what works either as a reader or as a writer or as an editor.
Yeah, exactly. And I often tell writers on the writing side that they should be reading in their genre primarily, but then also reading across genres, because you can pull techniques from other genres that aren't that make it a little bit different and unique for your genre. So one of it was a couple of years ago, Daisy Jones and the Six came out, and it was fantastic, and it was totally different. This is a novel, you guys, but I actually listened to it, and it sounded like I was listening to a nonfiction, like researched thing on some real band. And the way that she had done it was very narrative nonfiction. And so it was just a totally different world. And it blew up the book world because she had taken techniques from a different genre and applied it to fiction.
Well, and I think it's so important. Like, we both write in the Christian inspirational market. And I think sometimes it's really important to break out of that and see what's happening in other places. Like, I think about reading Where the Crawdads Sing, or, The Nightingale, because we both like historical fiction, or All the Light We Cannot See. Because there's so many books, and I love reading all of my friends who write Christian fiction, but I think it is really important to constantly be kind of going out and looking for, okay, what works and what doesn't work. And even though I'm not an editor, it's really hard to turn off the analytical part of my brain when I'm listening to books or reading books, because I want to know, okay, why does this book have 53,000, reviews on Goodreads or whatever? But if I'm not taking the time to read it, I can never analyze it to figure out, okay, what can I learn from this? Or where can I go? Oh, yeah, that just doesn't work for me. And here's why. So I want to make sure I don't do that in my writing.
It's funny to see how good writers read differently than other people. So I have sticky notes and highlighters and all sorts of things all over my different books. And I often have, I don't know what to call them, reference books, but they're not like research books. So they're flavor books. So for example, I'm in the process of writing a novella right now for Kriegel that will release in 22, October of 22. And my character has this internal dialogue that's kind of sassy, kind of irreverent, but not in like a anti-God way.
Yeah.
And Bill Bryson, who happens to be narrative nonfiction, and I read his book, A Walk in the Woods, with my kids while we were on vacation. And
that's kind of dangerous because you were in the mountains. I mean, you were in like the Gatlinburg area. And so I would be like, no, I'm not going hiking ever again.
It wasn't scary. It wasn't scary at all. Yeah, we were up and we were in the mountains. Like I almost stepped on a copperhead. We were in the mountains. Yeah. And on the back of our, like I went out of our little condo cottage thing and like went to go step down the steps and there was a copperhead.
Hello, wake up.
Yeah. So anyways, Bill Bryson has this kind of snarky, attitudinal conversation going in his head. It doesn't necessarily come out of his mouth, but it's going on in his head, and it's very much my character. So I will, if I'm stuck with her voice, because I don't have that snarky conversation going on in my head like my character does. So I'll read some of Bill Bryson and be like, okay, this is the groove of it. And I don't copy the words, but it gives you the feel of it so that you can kind of get that flavor going through your work. Kind of a
and I think that's where the value of reading broadly can come in, you know, just that, or watching movies and paying attention to the dialogue and things like that, just so you can get that pacing. Like one of the novellas that I have in a collection coming out in October, it's got that slightly snarky edge of like Meg Ryan and You've Got Mail, when Tom Hanks's character just pushes her and she's like, that's it. And she's like, oh. And it was so fun. But again, like you, I'm like, that's not how my brain normally works. And so Rachel Mcdaniel, who's one of our writing friends, and if you're reading along in the comments, we were both talking earlier about how much we really enjoyed Rachel's next book that comes out very quickly, Undercurrent of Secrets. And so highly recommend. But Rachel wants to know what your favorite part of writing is, because not only are you the editor, you're also a writer. So what's your favorite part when you've got your writing hat on?
The editing process for my own writing, which is so ironic. I love research. That's kind of why I'm a historical writer. I'm a huge history buff. And so I like digging in and finding these random historical facts, and they stick with me. So, you know, the book that's coming out in March that you referenced earlier, it's called Shadows in the Mind's Eye. And it's a guy who comes back from the Pacific War in World War II, and he's got what we would call now PTSD, and he's up in the mountains. And I was trying to find a location to put this story because it began with a question. My grandparents were like this amazing marriage, but my grandfather was in the war and he was a liaison pilot, which 70% of them did not come back. So I mean, this was like he was in it, you know. And I'm like, how did they like navigate all of this? So it began as this question, right? So I'm researching, trying to figure out where to put it. I wanted it in a small town. Talking to a really good friend of mine, and she's like, oh, you should set it in Arkansas. And I'm thinking, Arkansas?
Why Arkansas?
Why Arkansas? Well, her family all comes from Arkansas, and they had this whole story of stuff. And then I uncovered that Hot Springs, this little tiny town in the mountains of Arkansas, the Ouachita Mountains, which I had never heard of before I started researching, was the largest illegal gambling site in the nation at the time. And it was like all of the mob bosses from New York and from Chicago came down to Hot Springs, and it was totally sanctioned from the governor down to the sheriff.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Oh, so it's perfect for a suspense to happen right there.
Exactly. So I write historical, like with a little bit of intrigue, a little bit of romance. And so now I've got mob influence with this guy who's got PTSD, and he starts seeing things in the mountains, and you don't know if he's seeing things that are nefarious going down or if it's his PTSD talking.
Oh, wow. And that would be, especially for someone who was a pilot in the Pacific, that would ring so true, because the things they were seeing and having to do and experiencing were just, just horrifying. But then there's also that reality of they just didn't talk about it. They came back and they went back to work, but it didn't negate everything they had lived and experienced, and it's still there. So, yeah. Oh, that sounds
I had
so
to do
good.
I had to do a lot of work with a counselor. I was like, okay, how do I get this guy to be functional again?
Yeah,
Because it's not an easy thing. So, especially back
absolutely. Well, exactly, because even after World War One, you had, and of course now the term escapes me,
then.
the battle shock or whatever, where okay, it was PTSD. We just didn't know what to call it, or it hadn't been given a name yet. And then World War II, and you've got this second generation. I mean, there's no separation between them. It's the sons of the men who fought in World War I are now fighting in World War II. And so you've got this second generation of men who are coming back from just horrific war experiences, and then they just pull up their bootstraps and get back to it, but they don't all get back to it. And so it's so rich with getting the story right and helping people to understand what it was like. And so I love that you worked with a counselor so that you could honor this story of the men who came back like your character, and how they would have actually had to respond and what support they would have had or wouldn't have had. So how did you decide on kind of this World War II to Vietnam time period? Because there's so many different time periods within the historical genre. Why is that the 30 or 40 years that just really draws your attention and gives you the passion that you want to write books set during then?
So, I actually was not terribly interested in history until college. So I went to Taylor University. It's this little tiny school in Indiana. And Dr. Tom Jones was the US history professor, and it's a required class. And I took it begrudgingly, like most people would take it. And he gave me the best assignment I have ever had. And the assignment was to go talk to somebody in your family that had experienced the Depression, World War II, or Vietnam. And so my grandparents, I loved my grandparents, and they lived like an hour and a half, 2 hours from where I was going to school. So I drove up to their house and sat down and talked to them about the Depression and World War II. And I heard stories that I had never heard before. And it kind of launched this whole interest in this thing that I had no idea the stories behind the history. And so that started me. I talked to my grandma then like once a week for years and just wrote down all of her stories, and all of the things that she remembered from when she was a kid. And then I realized at some point that I had never done that with my parents. And so
Yeah.
I sat down and I started with them, and that's the Vietnam War era. And so those are the two kind of eras that I have an affinity to, because they're the people that I love and I care about experience those time frames. So it's like I can put skin on them.
Yeah.
Other people are amazing at writing that Regency or the turn of the century. We mentioned Rachel McDaniel, and her books are 1920s, and they're fantastic. And she like brings that era to life, and I love it. It's not home to me.
But I think I love how you put it, that it's the generation of World War II and Vietnam. You were able to put skin to it because it was your grandparents and it's your parents' generations. And one of my regrets is not asking more questions to one of my grandpas about his service, because he was at the Pentagon. But by the time I really fell in love with and started writing World War II, he had been gone and nobody knew what he did. No one had asked. And I was like, nobody really, no one. He had 5 kids. And so there was, unless I somehow got his records and really was able to dig into it, there is like this silent chapter. But I want to know what my grandpa did. And then like my other grandpa got drafted 4 times and got sent home each time because he was the only son of a farmer. And so that became Canteen Dreams, because I was like, what would that be like to be this healthy young man who can serve, but isn't being allowed to serve. And so, that kind of became that what if, because I could see the man my grandpa was and could start going, okay, so strong, silent, gruff type. And what would that have been like? How would you have thought? What would you have felt? And so that kind of that idea of the skin on the time period, I think is just a rich way of phrasing it. And so Beth is saying, I love how you say that it's not home, and that's beautiful. And I agree. There's so much good in this, and getting that idea of what's it like, and when we're writing the stories of a prior generation, making sure we're honoring it. So Linda was talking about how her dad fought during World War II and had combat fatigue. So that's one of the phrases for it, what we would now call PTSD. And so, and Rachel has commented twice that she loves the cover for your new book and that it sets the intense tone. So tell us a little bit about that process, because you've sat as the editor as well as the writer, and there's this very iterative process of getting the book actually published. And I don't know about you, but often when I'm having to fill out the cover sheet of, what ideas do you have for the cover? I'm like, I haven't even written the book yet. It's still an idea. Or I've got like 30,000 words left to write, so I don't really know all of it yet. So how did that process work for your book that's coming out in March?
So it was interesting because I sit on the titling committee and the cover committee, and I was also playing the role of the editor and the author, and so it's a very weird. It was very strange because part of my job as the editor, because of what I do, I also have very much of a marketing mind because I used to run marketing. So I play both sides of that really, really well. So part of it is market research. So just going out and looking at other titles that are in a similar area, both like, this book is being released in the Christian market. So both in the Christian market, but we also look at general market, and then like genre. So I write historical with a little bit of intrigue. So it needed to have a little bit of that darkness, but it couldn't be too dark. And we actually revamped the title. So we had titled it and I went, oh wait, marketing brain just kicked in. That's too dark for the CBA. We can't do that. So we went back and came up with Shadows in the Mind's Eye. And then the cover is actually a scene in the book. Yeah, so it's a, I don't want to give away too much, but it's a building on fire. And you can kind of see the outline of the mountains in the background. The main characters are peach farmers, so you'll see the shadows of the peach tree at the top. And so we pick out different elements from the book. And the author contributes some of that, but then we also have the editor who's typically been fairly involved in the process of putting the book together, giving input on the feel of the book and what we want somebody to feel when they look at a cover. That's one of the things that's really interesting is the interplay between the different art forms in general. So I think most authors listen to music and have a playlist for their books. And then I have pictures of the locations so that I can kind of see things. I'll pull artwork from the time period a lot of times too, just to kind of get me in the groove of that place. So I just love how art informs other art.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, because when I'm writing World War II, I will have a World War II playlist so that I have that feel of like Glenn Miller and Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy and those kinds of things. But then when I'm writing contemporary, I don't listen to that. I've got different music that I listen to, again, for that feel and to kind of set the environment or atmosphere. And so it can really be a helpful technique or a tool to kind of get my brain in that space. And sometimes when the ideas or the words just start flowing, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm not listening to the right music. I've got other friends who they can't listen to anything. They can't even have instrumental music on because it's too distracting. Whereas my mind can't settle in without it. So are there any of those kinds of, I'm going to call them triggers, but like prompts that let you know, oh, okay, now it's time to write, or, oh, now it's time to edit?
Yeah, so I do the same thing, Cara. I pull in work music from the different time periods. I use a lot of movie tracks too, movie
Yes.
soundtracks of movies that are done from that time period and pull it in. So yeah, a lot of Glenn Miller, those different the different songs. The interesting thing is I can't have words. It's very rare for me to be able to listen to music that has words when I'm writing. So it becomes more difficult when I'm writing in the Vietnam War era because a lot of the music then had more words. So I'm getting used to it a little bit more. I'm blanking. Oh, Queen's Gambit. So I listen to a lot of the soundtrack from Queen's Gambit when I'm writing in the Vietnam War era because it has that, more synthesized 70s era, 70s era, but there's no words. And then when I edit my day job, I listen to a lot of instrumental folk music.
Really?
It's upbeat and it's fun. A lot of classical guitar running, and it's upbeat enough that I don't fall asleep. But I'm a classical musician, so like listening to classical music is very distracting to me because it's more complex and I'm following what's going on in the music and I'm tracking with it in my mind subconsciously, so I get distracted. So I have to be careful. I will listen. There's specific pieces that I will listen to because music ends up in all of my books anyway.
So what do you play when you say you're a classical musician? What do you play?
So I played piano since kindergarten. And then in 5th grade, I started playing clarinet. And I played clarinet until my daughter was born. So I played clarinet for about 30 years in like groups. And then I picked up random instruments too. So I played saxophone and I can play brass instruments. I'm not very good. I wouldn't be able to, it would take a while for me to do it now, but and then like super random stuff. I was such a band geek when I was in school that I picked up instruments like the fife, the penny whistle, all sorts of just really random things. So I basically don't play stringed instruments. I play everything. I'm capable of playing everything else.
That's really amazing. And I mean, technically a piano is a stringed instrument. It's just kind of
True that.
down, but not a harp or a cello or something like that.
No, I don't play violin. My husband plays violin and he tried to teach me and it was not a pretty sight.
Screech.
And there's no fret. So it's like.
Yeah, I can play the piano, but not like that. But but it is kind of fun just to have that another way to be creative. And so that's fascinating. So as we start wrapping this up, because our half hour is almost gone already, what is one book that you would recommend as a great read, not from your editor hat, not from your writer hat, but from your reader hat? What's something that you've read this year that you're like, everyone should make time to read it?
Hamlet, but with an L instead of an N. And it is about Shakespeare's son. And I was like thinking it was going to be totally stuffy and dry. And my friend Susie Finkbeiner, Susie too. Yeah. But I love her book recommendations. And she was like, no, seriously, you have to read this book. And I was like, okay, I'll read this book. It was so good. It was so entertaining and like drops you right in the world. It has twists and turns. I was really, really surprised. And awesome. I thought it was a really good book.
And that was Hamlet or Hamnet.
Hamnet. So like ham, like you eat, and then net, like you.
Okay. So fun. I haven't read that one yet, so I just made a note because I'm always looking for recommendations.
Maggie O'Farrell, I think. Awesome. That's off the top of my head. So yeah. And I'm always recommending books. So if you guys want to join me on Instagram or my newsletter too, and I know you do the same, Cara, I'm forever recommending books and talking about cool things. And I'm actually a photographer too, so I take pretty pictures.
Yeah, it is so fun because every Friday you have like Friday first lines, and then you're constantly talking about different books and then those amazing photos. And so definitely y'all need to be following Janyre on Instagram. And if you join her newsletter, which you could do probably through Instagram and through her website, I believe you get a free story, don't you?
You sure do. There's a novella. It's called Wide Open, and it's Vietnam War era. And it's just a short, I think it's like 20,000 words. I don't even know how many pages that is. 100 pages, just a little less. Yeah, and it's totally free for everybody that signs up. And yeah, I do a lot of freebie type things, and I just talk books and have fun.
Yeah.
So I'd love to
And
have you join me.
And it's such a great way to actually get a feel for like her writing. The same thing when you join my newsletter, you can get Dying for Love for free, which is a novella that kicks off Hidden Justice. And so often authors will do that. And it's a wonderful way, if you've never tried their books, to get a taste for how they write and discover how much you're going to love all of their books. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. This has been so fun to reconnect with you and get your insights and everything. And next week, Jen Toronto will be with me. And so if you haven't read her Gilded Age rom-coms, they are so much fun. So be sure and check back next week. But thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Cara.